Welcome back to the Piping Pastor Theology Talks. Today we'll be discussing miracles, or more specifically, perhaps, divine action. Well, as I mentioned in my last video, I would be leading into theological anthropology. However, it occurred to me that it may behoove us to have a wee discussion on God acting in the physical world, which many people refer to as miracles, and which I will refer to as divine action. While we're having our little discussion, me and my rather dark ensemble today, I am smoking a Balkan mixture today out of my Boswell pipe. So, divine action. When most people think about God acting in the world, they think in terms of miracles. They think of such things in the Old Testament as parting of the Red Sea, the plagues of Egypt that Pharaoh had to deal with. In the New Testament, of course, all the miracles of Christ, water into wine, miraculous healing, so on and so forth. Now, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, took miracles on and laid down some logic, which at the time made a great deal of sense to several people, and is not the most popular of views, which is not the most popular of views amongst Christians, which is that if God laid down the created order, and then God acts against that created order in a miraculous fashion, in point of fact, interrupting the created order, that is, in essence, God acting against God's self. So, if God were to part the Red Sea, it would be interrupting the natural flow and order of the environment. So, God breaking one of God's own natural laws, which to Hume seemed improbable. And atheists since then have really latched onto that argument, saying that, well, of course, God's acting against God's self. That's so miracles can't happen, right? Was God taken by surprise? Did God not know this is going to happen? Does God have to use whiteout on God's creation to help things along? It doesn't seem to make sense. Well, on the surface, sure. At the time when Hume wrote that, you were looking at the universe through Newtonian physics. Contemporarily, we have a greater understanding of the universe since the discovery of quantum physics, quantum mechanics, quantum indeterminacy, the randomness of wave function collapse, all these various different things that demonstrates to us that the universe is far more open than we had thought previously. It's not all just straight cause and effect, back and forth. There's more to it than that. So in light of that, that argument takes some re-examination. Beyond that, you also have to understand that Hume was working on a deist view of the universe, the clockmaker God. It was really rather popular in the Enlightenment. The idea that God created the universe, set it in motion, and then just kind of sits back. And the deist view is rather fallen out of favor. I'm sure there's still some out there. But deist and process theologians are rather in the minority. We'll get into process theology at another point. But I apologize. I should set my ashtray off here to the side rather than keep reaching towards the camera. But the idea that God interrupts God's creation to miraculously intervene doesn't take into account the fact that we don't know that much about physical reality. Ask any physicist worth their salt to explain physical reality, specifically mention dark matter. they will rather quickly admit that there is a great deal that they haven't figured out yet. Now, there is a great deal they do know. It's not as if physicists are just walking around blindly. But as my friend Mark Harris once said, dark matter is the great embarrassment of physics. It makes up a large portion of reality. We have no idea what it is. So the idea that we have it all figured out and that certain things would happen in a certain way and any kind of interruption of the would mean miraculous outside the laws of physics. Well, maybe not. There is entirely the possibility that there are deeper laws that we haven't discovered yet, that we haven't figured out. Remember, the laws of physics are not um, predictive, they're descriptive. The laws of physics is something that we look at and describe things the way they are. So 2 plus 2 exists apart from our observation of it because it is a law as our physics. So we as humans trying to figure that out, put labels on things is where that comes from. So the idea that we have everything figured out doesn't necessarily ring true. So it's entirely possible that God is acting within the laws of physics that we don't understand at a really deep level yet. Now, what I will not do is play the God of the gaps. The God of the gaps is where we have a gap in understanding. And it's like, oh, well, that's where God must be. When it comes to creation, when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, quantum indeterminacy, dark matter. I'm not going to say that, dark matter is God. That's the presence of God in the universe. We don't know, because whenever we do that, whenever we have a gap in our scientific understanding of the universe and we place God into that gap because we assume that, well, if we don't know, that's where God's operating, eventually, we get to figure that part out and it squeezes God out of that gap. And then it makes it ever more difficult for us to understand how God interacts with the universe in physical matter. God is a spiritual being interacting with physical matter. I'm having a devil of a time trying to keep this lit because I'm talking too much, probably. But what I will say, though, we can absolutely see God working in and through the universe on a regular basis. If you have a theological cosmology in line with Christianity, then you also have to have an understanding that God is in, through, and present in all of the universe. I think otherwise to say there are sections of the universe that God is prohibited from entering, which limits God's omnipresent activity, lessens God's omniscience, and so on and so forth. It takes apart the idea of God and places God in different places where God can operate over here, but God may not necessarily operate over here because God is prohibited from operating over here, right? God may limit God's self in relation to the universe, but that is God's self-limiting. That is not necessarily God being prohibited from acting. So if we take into account that God is present in all the universe, then God's actions are present in all the universe, then God may definitely act in all the universe. Therefore, divine action is constant. God's activity and God's presence in the universe is an ongoing thing. Now, we're not talking here about creation continua, which is the idea that creation only continues because God holds it in place. God holds everything together. That lines up rather neatly with process theology, which is something we'll discuss in another video. But what we're talking about here is the omnipresent and omniactive action of God in the universe. And in that, it means that there is no miraculous intervention or miraculous stoppage of the laws of physics. It's not that the laws of physics are going along merrily on their way, and God says, okay, wait a minute, my people over here in Egypt need an escape route. I'm going to stop the laws of physics. I'm going to stop the laws of nature that I have established, put a pause button on that, make something happen, let them go through, and then boom, laws of physics are back in place, right? I'm not saying that, because that's not how God operates. Secondly, I'm not going to say that there are natural phenomena that can explain these things that just happen to occur. I'm saying it is the combination of two. God acting in and through nature, God acting in and through the laws that God has established in a way that we can't understand. So, yes, these occurrences did take place. Jesus did do what Jesus had, what has been attributed to Jesus. Things in the Old Testament did occur as they have been depicted, and they're not because of some volcano erupting. You see, we get into trouble when we try to explain a miraculous event through natural means that don't line up necessarily with Scripture. I mentioned the volcano eruption, of course, and the volcanic eruption that is used to explain the plagues of Egypt, which is a neat explanation. However, if the volcanic eruption, the ashes, the red tide, all the various different ways that people explain the plagues of Egypt through that eruptive event that it was in and around that same time, they wouldn't have occurred in the order that they were recorded in the Old Testament. So you're playing fast and loose with Scripture, which you shouldn't do. Reading Scripture, contextually criticizing, historically criticizing, literary criticizing, I have no problem with. However, if you're going to say, well, they just got things out of order, well, that's a leap. That is an assumption. There's no historical fact that you can base that on. You have the text, and that's all you have. And if it doesn't line up, then that's not the explanation. If you're going to be academically honest in the investigation of miracles, then you have to be academically honest in the perusal of a text. God can act in and through nature. Divine action can occur on a continual basis. Spiritual action can have an effect on physical matter in a way that we can somewhat discern through the physical laws of the universe and the other laws that we don't necessarily understand. Well, that is it for this time. Divine action on physical matter is one of my areas of research. So I'm sure we'll be revisiting that again. If there are any further questions, I would be happy to engage in those in the text. And if there's several questions, I'll do another video to respond. But in the meantime, we will perhaps do one more video to cover a bit more on divine action, perhaps, if there's need. If not, we'll jump right into theological anthropology, as I promised, and we'll discuss the evolution of humanity. So until then, I hope you have a great week, and as always, happy reading.